Yes.
Okay. So yeah, today I will be talking about driving tax expenditure reform in times of COVID-19 with a specific focus on developing countries. So we know that the economic impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, will be unprecedented, the global impact. The latest estimates by the OECD show that the global economic downturn will be of around 6% in 2020. We know that estimates are being updated on a monthly basis. I think today, even the IMF was releasing the economic outlook, so there might be new figures coming soon. In any case, what we know is that the impact across countries will be highly heterogeneous. It ranged from minus 1.2% in Korea, a bit less than 3% in China and Indonesia, to more than 11 percentage points of downturn, economic downturn in Italy, France, and Spain. What we know is that that will have implications. For instance, it will be the first time since 1998 when global poverty will increase. So here we have estimates for different scenarios that the World Bank put together. And as you can see, the millions of people in extreme poverty pre-COVID-19 was here in any of the scenarios, even the most conservative one or the most negative one in a sense, the increase will be very significant. So although the global impact will be global and heterogeneous across countries, not necessarily developing economies will suffer more in terms of economic downturn. The impact, as you see from these estimates, again on the OECD, you can see both advanced and developing countries at the bottom right of this graph. That means the largest reductions in GDP per capita, no, in GDP, sorry, this is GDP, not GDP per capita. But also, sorry, here on the left side, this is the largest. And also on the right side, so the countries that will suffer the least, also you see a bunch of developed and developing countries. So there's really no correlation between GDP and the impact that countries will suffer out of the pandemic. Where there is correlation is in the consequences that this downturn will trigger in different countries. And again, if we come back to poverty, I showed you that the global poverty will increase, then the regional distribution, clearly the countries or the regions that will suffer the most in terms of poverty are the poor regions. So here you have South Asia and Africa in any of the scenarios, whichever poverty line you take into consideration, are the regions that will suffer the most. So here in the consequence, we do see a correlation with GDP. And why is that the case? Well, clearly because developing countries are less resilient to face the pandemic and also has less resources to cope with economic impact and reboot the economy. So just a few figures in terms of health system and living standards. If you compare Africa to the OECD, the numbers of health workers per 1,000 people are roughly 10 times in OECD countries compared to Africa. Just a few anecdote cases. Central African Republic has only 3 ventilators for roughly 5 million people, and Malawi only 25 intensive care beds for 70 million inhabitants. That's very low to face such a health shock. We also know that 2 billion people live in countries with high water stress, and obviously most of these people live in poor countries, in developing countries. And we all know how important just washing our hands with water is to reduce the spread of the virus. But what is more important for this seminar is the reduced fiscal space, or the reduced availability of resources, economic resources that these countries have to face or to weather their storm. So let me concentrate on fiscal space and why are these countries facing such a reduced fiscal space? Well, again, for a bunch of reasons. High debt levels. 26 low-income countries face high risk of external debt distress, and 6 are already in distress. We know that the World Bank and the IMF have been pushing or calling for debt relief programs. We still don't know the details. That would certainly help, but I don't think it will be enough. International aid will probably decrease due to budget constraints in many donor countries, and although many of these countries are trying to put effort to continue the flows of international aid into poor countries. Capital outflows. So in the first 2 months, the IMF estimated that more than 100 billion flew out of emerging markets. Just to give you a sense of this figure, this is more than 3 times than during the 2008 crisis. So that's huge. Remittances, another source or crucial source of revenue for these countries, will suffer the sharpest decline in recent history, roughly minus 20%. And obviously, the main indicator of domestic revenue mobilization, tax to GDP ratios, which were already low before the pandemic. Many developing countries have ratios of about 50% or lower. And this 50% is a threshold that is accepted as the minimum to allow for takeoff, for these economies to take off. And again, here we do see a correlation with GDP. So on the left side of the x-axis, you see least developed countries in green, emerging economies in blue, and the lowest tax to GDP ratio between 0 or very low numbers and 15. And then in red, advanced economies. These economies usually have higher tax to GDP ratios. And why is the case that tax to GDP ratios are so low? Well, one of the reasons, there are many, but one of the reasons are narrow tax bases. If you think about personal income taxation, the informal sector plays a crucial role and is significantly larger in developing countries, with 90% of informal workers in many countries, whereas in advanced economies is as low as 5%, or in any case, lower than 20% in most of the cases. Tax revenue will shrink further as a consequence of the pandemic. We know that. We talked about the collapse in activity. I just showed you a few figures. Behavioral responses, compliance, people would just stop paying taxes because they don't have the money to do so. They will prioritize other consumption strategies. And another issue that is relevant for this presentation is tax policy. The measures, the tax policy measures that governments are implementing, some of them will contribute to the decrease in tax revenue collection. Let me focus on that tax policy aspect. And in particular, there are many policy responses that governments are implementing across the world. The IMF has a nice tracker where you can disentangle between monetary policy responses, fiscal policy responses. The OECD has another one. But here, let me focus on tax expenditures, given the scope of this seminar, and why I think that this is a crucial area in the context of the COVID-19 for developing countries. Well, the first reason, clearly, it's the magnitude of tax expenditures, the fiscal cost of these provisions. So there are not accurate estimates of tax expenditures, comparable estimates across the world. This is a pretty old figure put together by the World Bank, Sebastian James from the World Bank. You can see that tax expenditures as a percentage of GDP are very high in many countries, both advanced economies like the UK here and the US, but also poor countries like Burundi or Guatemala. And you have countries where it's relatively low, like 3%, around 3% of GDP, percentage points of GDP, again, in advanced and poor countries. So we don't see a correlation of the size of tax expenditures, but in any case, it's not negligible and it's very significant in many, many cases. So this is a lot of money. Just to give you a few more figures, $1.5 trillion, that's a lot of money in the US every year in revenue forgone through tax expenditures. To put figures in context, roughly 35% of direct government spending, and again, a bit more than 7 percentage points of GDP. In Latin America, tax expenditures range from 0.7 to 6.6 percentage points of GDP. Same in Africa. And if you compare the African figures to tax revenue collection, then they range between 8 percentage points of tax revenue, to around 60 percentage points. That's a lot. These are figures that we have been putting together in a project that we are working together with colleagues from DIE in Germany. the Global Tax Expenditures database. I hope to be able to give you news soon on this project. But you can see here the tax expenditures as percentage of tax revenue and GDP for African countries, for those African countries that do report on tax expenditures. Most of them do not. And again, figures are large. But what about the net effect? One could argue that these figures that I just showed relate to the cost, the fiscal cost of these provisions. But if the benefits, let's assume, of a tax incentive to attract FDI are high, then we might end up in a situation where tax revenue is increasing. Well, that's just not the case very often. Here, the World Bank recently put together figures indicating that the more tax incentives you implement on the x-axis here, the impact on tax revenue collection is negative. So you see a negative relationship, and it's a big effect on tax revenue, and it's significant. So the second point why I think tax expenditures are crucial are the lack of effectiveness in reaching their policy objectives. As I mentioned before, tax incentives for investment are very often ineffective. There's a lot of evidence out there showing that usually these are redundant. So that means that the projects would have taken place anyhow without the tax incentive in place. This is based again on World Bank data. It's an investor survey, so we can think that this would be on the lower bound because of under reporting. But in some countries like Rwanda, pretty much all tax incentives are redundant. So it doesn't make sense really for the government to implement it because the project would have taken place anyhow. Windfall gains, we can think as an anecdote evidence again for Amazon. Besides profits skyrocketing in the last years, the effective tax rate that Amazon paid in the US on federal taxes was negative in 2018. That means that the government actually gave money back to Amazon. There are many reasons, but one of the main reasons is all the tax incentives that Amazon take advantage from in the US. So this is not only a question about incentives in the context of CIT of corporate income taxes. In the context of VAT, many tax expenditures are implemented to mitigate inequality, but again, they are often ineffective in doing so. Here we see that VAT reduced rates for restaurants and food are clearly being so the ones that are clearly taking advantage of those benefits are the rich guys on the top of the income distribution in the 8th, 9th, and 10th deciles of the income distribution. This is not what we would like to see to reduce inequality. And the third point, and I will be almost done, regards the negative externalities that many of these provisions trigger despite where they are effective or not in reaching their policy objectives or goals. One example is the impact on the environment. So you all heard about fossil fuel subsidies. Again, this is a lot of money across the world. And clearly, whether you want to lower energy prices for the poor or other goals that you might pursue as a policymaker, you have to internalize the impact that these provisions have on the environment. This is something that the OECD and the IMF have been working on. And another example is the distributive impact. If you think about greening the economy, in many countries we implement tax credits, for instance, for electric vehicles. That could make sense. But when you take a look at the income distribution and who, again, is taking advantage of these provisions in the US, you see that the benefits of this tax credit are highly concentrated, even more than the income distribution itself, which in the US is already highly concentrated. So one question that governments would like to pose themselves is who is really taking benefit of the different tax expenditure provisions they implement. And my last slide regards policy implications. So what can we think, or what's the message, the takeaway message, where there's clearly no one-fits-all approach to face the impact of the COVID-19. What I would say is that in any case, in any context and for every country, tax expenditures should be rationalized. And I will tell you what I mean by rationalized. That holds in any context for any country, but particularly in developing countries in terms of COVID-19 for the reasons that I just discussed. What I mean by rationalizing tax expenditures were with Rita de la Feria, who recently wrote a T20 policy brief, where we suggest a very concrete 3-stage process to rationalize the use of tax expenditures, where the first stage regards the estimation and reporting of tax expenditures. This is crucial. I'm finishing, it's my last line here. So it's the estimation and reporting of tax expenditures. This is crucial, it's the necessary condition to go to stage 2, which is the assessment of the effectiveness and efficiency of tax expenditures. This requires impact evaluations, cost-benefit analysis, and based on the results of those assessments, governments should reform tax expenditures. That means phasing out or getting rid of those provisions that do not make sense in terms of cost-benefit, and expanding those provisions that do make sense, such as, for instance, the earned income tax rate in the US. So I will stop there. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Agustin. Someone has a question? Please raise your hand. You know, if you raise your hand here, then you can ask a question.
So I will stop sharing so that we can see each other now.
Yes. So I don't see any questions yet, but I do have a question. Because normally with tax incentives, the literature says one thing is about the costs and benefits, and another one is about the administrative considerations. And what happens now with COVID-19 is that the countries are introducing the tax incentives, but they are not really looking at either the costs and benefits of the administrative considerations regarding, for instance, transparency, accountability, evaluation, and so forth. So one of the questions I have is how we can help now, or what we can do now for developing countries, since they need to have introduced the tax, or at least they think that they would like to have the tax incentive. And then therefore the economy needs to keep going, but at the same time, they do not have the time to go through the whole process. So what are the 3 main things that a developing country should focus on, Agustin?
So, my take my first takeaway message is, if you want to reboot the economy, maybe tax incentives is not the way to move forward in any case, despite the COVID-19. Again, I'm not against tax incentives per se or by definition. I'm just saying that the evidence shows that very often these are redundant, so you would not get the impact that you are looking for in terms of economic output anyhow. But in the case where you really need to do it as a policymaker, at least you should be able to come up with estimates on the fiscal cost. You want to know or have an idea on how much money that measure will cost to the government, even more in times where resources are lacking, right? And then the second part would be in terms of how much tracking you can do in terms of the impact that measure will have. So you don't want to kind of give a white envelope or white card to tax holidays, things that you cannot track the impact. You rather want to apply or implement targeted or specific provisions where you are able to follow up a bit more in terms of their impact.
That's a good idea. Actually, targeted incentives should be better than just giving the whole tax incentive of the tax holiday in general. I have a question from Gaurav Pundir, and please make sure that you are a little short because we also want to give time for other questions, but welcome, Gaurav, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on this platform. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question is very quick. So even before 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act in the US, there was this realization that these tax incentives are, redundant. But still, we saw that the diagnosis which was offered was a cut in tax rates to 21% from 35%. So my question is that these corporations have some sort of monopoly power over the governments, right? And so how can we handle this political economy side of it given that now governments are more fragile in post-COVID era compared to what they were in the before that. So how can we handle the politics of it? Because
yeah, so first, what you refer to, the decrease in the corporate income tax rate in the US, that would be lowering statutory tax rates, which is not exactly the same than implementing tax expenditures. There are many differences. When you just lower the corporate income tax rate, you are doing that for all corporations. When you implement a tax expenditure, you are targeting a specific sector or group or business. So that's one difference. But regarding your the political economy behind the implementation of any fiscal policy, but also of tax expenditures, I agree. Very often governments are not in a position of bargaining. I don't think that's the case in the US. I think that's more the case in developing countries. Alexandra Redhead will talk about the mining sector, and I think that's a crucial issue in that area for many extractive countries that are based their economies in the extractive sector. But in any case, I think that the COVID-19, if anything, also kind of switches that bargaining power in a sense, right? So we have seen many corporations, even large corporations in rich countries, that are struggling during these days. So they also are losing a bit of power in the bargaining game, if you want to think it like that, right? So if anything, we should think this as a possibility for government to be more proactive in the policies they decide, and kind of, you know, try to put the level playing field at the same level between governments and large corporations in a sense. So many corporations are really struggling to survive, and the only player that can help right now is the state, right? That's what we see in many countries. So maybe it's an opportunity to kind of switch that bargaining game.
Agustin, I'll give the word to Wei Shan. Yeah. And yes.
Thank you very much. I have a very quick question. I'm Wei Zhang from City Austin. Amidst the COVID-19, some countries, including Indonesia, imposed a VAT on goods and services provided by foreign suppliers via online means. That's a so-called VAT on digital goods and services. I'm wondering what is Agustino's comments on this type of development, because I notice many countries are following the suit. Thanks.
Yeah, so yeah, the digital economy and the tax expenditures or tax policy in the context of the digital trade, it's a particular topic, and it has different implications on different countries depending on how large these online platforms are and the digital sector is. What I can say is that usually the fact of penalizing services that are provided by foreign providers can have detrimental effects on trade liberalization, which is something that we wouldn't like to see in general. But yeah, it's something very specific that we are following closely, and you have all follow the stories about the digital tax also, and how that will have implications and reactions from other countries. Irma has been also working on that, so maybe she has taken this. But certainly, these kind of tax expenditures, particularly in the digital sector, will have implications for international trade, and we have to be careful about that.
Agustin, I have two questions. When you don't know how to raise the hand, just let us know via the chat, and I will check on that. One is Valpy, Edmund Valpy Fitzgerald, and the another one is Johan. So I would say, just if you can just make it very short, and Agustin, your answer also could be very short, so we can give the time to other speakers. Yes, please, Edmund.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Well, thank you, Agustin, for a really impressive run through the data in 15 minutes. I just want to underline something which you probably meant, but may not be clear to people, that the tax expenditures include, most of them are in fact on VAT. And the World Bank's emphasis is on trying to raise VAT rates, not trying to stop giveaways to large corporations. And I think it's important to remember that the World Bank's position on VAT, unlike the IMF, is in support of this very regressive tax mechanism. So I think it'd be useful if you could explain to us the different views of the bank and the fund on progressive tax incidents.
So to be honest, I'm not aware of that difference, different position between the two institutions. So maybe you can give us a quick view on that. I was not aware that there was like an institutional position regarding VAT tax expenditures and a different one between the IMF and the World Bank.
Well, the IMF believes that VAT has reached a limit, right? And that any future increases in tax to GDP ratios had to come from direct taxation, right? Not indirect taxation. The bank takes the view that that the informal sector has to be taxed more, that tax VAT reductions on food and so on must be reduced and so on. So there's a large difference between the two institutions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you put it right now, I see that there is a large difference. I was not aware, to be honest, about the different institutional positions, so I would have to take a look deeper to that, but I would be happy to follow up.
I think it's interesting because
totally.
The World Bank is supposed to be the institution that's supposed to be the leader on poverty, right? It takes a regressive position on taxation.
I would be happy to follow up on that.
Yeah, we can also, with your presentation, also that issue. I will just give a final word to Johan for this presentation, and then we go to Sanjeev. Johan from Oxford.
Fine.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, this is Johan. I'm working at Oxfam as a tax policy advisor. Just a quick clarification. At Oxfam, when we do advocacy on tax incentives, we always make the difference between profit-based tax incentives and investment-based tax incentives. So for example, tomorrow we're launching a new report in Southeast Asia, and we really tell them, get rid of the profit-based tax incentives and just monitor very well your investment-based tax incentives. In your presentation, the differentiation between both was less clear, but maybe you could elaborate on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. In 15 minutes, I was just showing, like, if you want an average effect and pulling together, but I totally agree with you. There are many differences within the different categories of tax incentives. Also, if we think about, I don't know, R&D tax credits and, output related or input related. So there are many differences where we can play, and we shouldn't put all the eggs in the same basket, to put it one way. Totally right. This is just to give you a mark, but in any case, whether it's one type or the other, I would totally push governments to be more transparent and follow up and evaluate the effectiveness of these incentives. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, it's not all provisions are the same.
Yeah. I will thank you so much, Agustin. Thank you so much for the questions as well for everyone. And I will give the word to Sanjeev Gupta. He's a senior policy fellow from the Center for Global Development. Please, Sanjeev, you have your 15 minutes. You are mute. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah, Juliana can do it. Yes. No.
It doesn't let me.
Yeah.
Wait, is it okay now? It's done?
It's okay.
Let me put my PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Thank you. But let me take up the point which was made by the last speaker about the difference between the fund and the bank. There is no such thing. I was deputy director of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department for 11 years, and there is no such big difference between the two institutions. And so I can respond to the questions later on, but let me go on to my presentation, where the point that I'm trying to make is really that of course, COVID presents a lot of challenges along the lines that Agustin set forth, but it is also presenting some interesting opportunities for the countries to reform their systems. And that is basically the message of my presentation. And my presentation has 5 sort of short sections. Because the focus is on fiscal policy, so how has the fiscal policy responded to COVID-19 in some of the countries? And what have been the nature of those responses in some of the selected developing countries? And what is the changing landscape which is facing developing countries? Some of the points were very nicely made by Agustin, but I want to discuss in the context of the fiscal implications. And then make a case that with these challenges that have come up, there are opportunities for the countries to redesign their revenue raising strategy post-COVID. And what should that policy response ought to be? And that is my presentation. So the first thing, the global impact of COVID on economic output and public finances is projected to be massive in 2020 and beyond. As Agustin said, all countries are using fiscal policies to mitigate pandemic's impact and promote economic activity. And of course, the cost of fiscal measures has ranged between 1% and 40% of GDP. It's a huge amount of spending that countries have undertaken. And the fiscal packages are much larger in advanced economies for the reasons that Agustin mentioned. The advanced economies have much larger fiscal space. And there are quite a few measures where they have provided liquidity support to enterprises. And so the spending on health has increased. So if you add up globally the cost of those measures, it adds up to roughly $10 trillion, which is a huge chunk of money. And if you compare that with the amount which was spent at the time of the financial crisis, it is at least 4 or 5 times larger. So what have been the fiscal packages in selected developing countries? So let me give you examples from few of the countries, because this has implications for fiscal policy going forward. So in Kenya, for example, what they did was to reduce the standard VAT, personal and corporate income tax, and turnover tax. In Senegal, they reduced taxes on hotels, restaurants, and transport sector. And then in some of the countries, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Zambia, they waived import duty on medical equipment. And on the spending side, the countries started to give more social assistance. In Senegal, they used to give social assistance to 250,000 families. That was extended to 1 million families with the arrival of COVID-19. So if you look across in Africa, roughly 85% of the spending programs are on the social assistance type, and only 2 or 3% are on the cash assistance type. And the fiscal packages, as I said, in the developing countries or in sub-Saharan Africa are smaller. The highest that I could see was in Senegal so far, which is about 7% of GDP. And all these measures that are listed here, as I said, they have implications for fiscal policy going forward. They're going to reduce revenues in relation to GDP in 2020 and possibly beyond. And this would have some important implications for public spending and fiscal deficit. So that's something we have to keep in mind. So what is the changing landscape facing developing countries? So, you know, we see all these things, but one impact that we are going to see, not only in developing countries, but also in advanced economies, the crisis is likely to alter the economic structure of the countries. Now, loss of revenues from tourism, loss of revenues from commodities, fall in remittances, and there is a study which came out in the US which said that out of the 44 million jobs which have been lost in the US as a result of the pandemic, some 22 million jobs will not come back. We don't know how precise that number is likely to be, but one thing's for sure, number of things will change, and a similar kind of impact is going to be felt in the developing countries, which will have implications for both revenue and spending policies. Augustin talked about debt to GDP ratio in some of the highly indebted countries, and in Africa, the debt to GDP ratio stood at 57% in 2019, which is pretty high. And Senegal's debt to GDP ratio is about 65%. In Kenya, it's over 65%. So these are, and with the spending policies and expansionary fiscal policy, one would tend to see these deficits and the debt to be rising over time. The other thing which is important to remember is that tax compliance, I think Augustin mentioned this, is going to weaken. If you look back at the 2008 financial crisis, at that time too, the ability of revenue authorities to collect taxes came down drastically. So one would expect, and I think Augustin hinted at the weakening of tax compliance. And finally, the outlook for aid flows is likely to change with the rising debt to GDP ratio in donor countries. The latest projection, the average debt to GDP ratio in the donor countries exceeds 100% at present. And the debt to GDP ratio is expected to rise by another 25 percentage points, assuming there are no other major increases in spending or in tax cuts. So going forward, the implication is that one would have to think of a post-COVID revenue-raising strategy, which would embrace a comprehensive reform package, including policies that have encountered political opposition in the past, such as reform of tax expenditures. And this would be one of the key elements, that is reversal of reform of tax expenditures. It would also have to include reversal of poorly targeted tax measures, such as the VAT rate cut and reduction in the top personal tax rate in Kenya. And the government will also have to make sure that they spend their limited resources better, because otherwise taxpayers are not going to take their obligations seriously. And the expectation would be that these steps would garner popular support because they would be perceived as fair. Now, this is necessary because to be able to finance SDGs, their source requirements are large. In 5 areas, education, health, roads, electricity, water, and sanitation, the IMF estimated that you need roughly 15% of GDP on average in low-income countries. These are the additional resources. And they also said that the countries would have to collect, the low-income countries, around 5% of GDP additional tax revenues to be able to fund SDGs. Now the revenue position has become worse as a result of COVID. So the requirements have become even larger. So what should the targeted policy response comprise? of. The COVID-19 presents an opportunity to implement reforms, and that would include, as Agustin talked about, scrutiny of all tax expenditures and instituting enhanced budget transparency, which is very, very important. One of the reasons why I, along with Agustin, have been complaining about tax expenditures, and I've been organizing roundtables with the finance ministers in Washington, D.C., is because these tax expenditures are eroding the tax base. And what that has meant is that if they collect more revenues from VAT or some other tax source, it is then given away in the form of more tax expenditures. Now, some of these tax expenditures, their origin lies in industrial policy, but they have morphed into protection for politically connected. And Senegal, for example, Agustin had the same number. In 2014, they estimated these tax expenditures of 7.8% of GDP, amounting to 40% of tax revenues. In Ghana, they add up to roughly 50% of the tax revenues. And Kenya, it's very common for companies to shut down their operation when their tax concession expire and open a new company with a different name in other jurisdiction to avail of tax benefits. So, and then you look around in Bangladesh, you find that they have exempted much of income emanated from the growing ready-made garment sector and the other sectors of the economy which are expanding, thereby limiting the revenue growth. And Bangladesh collects only 11% of GDP as taxes. In Latin America, tax expenditures average 4% of GDP. This is one region where the estimates exist very widely, but from what I can see, they do have a discussion on tax expenditures, but they are not able to reform them in the way they should be. So so as Agustin said, the comprehensive revenue strategy should include public listing of all tax concessions and discussing them in the parliament in the context of the annual budget, and then publishing information on beneficiaries of tax concessions. And one of the things that is happening is that roughly 87 to 90 countries have come to the IMF for assistance as a result of COVID. And one of the things that the countries are committing as part of this assistance, which has been dispersed very rapidly, is to a high level of transparency of public spending. That is, they should undertake to publish procurement contracts and audit their accounts. Now, this requirement should be leveraged to become a part of the comprehensive approach that I'm talking about. Now, I'm just ending. The other elements of the targeted policy should include dealing with international tax challenges that arise in the context of multinationals, rather than focusing on minimum standards as stressed under the G20 OECD base erosion profit shifting initiative. These countries could impose a limit on how much the interest deductions multinationals can make, and also impose a withholding tax on dividends, interest, royalties, management fees, and technical services. And then they could also go for eliminating temporary tax cuts given under COVID, as they would impair the effectiveness of the tax system in the future. One should also not ignore the need to enhance the effectiveness of VAT productivity. There's a huge gaps that have been estimated in the potential to raise more taxes as regards VAT. And of course, there's a need to look into strengthening and implementing property taxes and adjusting excise taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and petroleum. And petroleum, I spent about 8-10 years working at the fund on the estimates that Agustin was talking about. Those estimates of $5.2 trillion are roughly associated with the externalities in the consumption of fossil fuels. And if one were to tax, one could raise roughly 2 to 4 percentage points of additional revenue. And some of this revenue, well, in fact, most of it could be used to lower other taxes and to provide social assistance or to fund social assistance programs. And finally, I think the focus on taxes is just not enough, because we have to also think of enhancing the efficiency of spending, because it can free up as many resources as through increased mobilization of domestic resources. And if one looks around, there's a huge scope for improving the quality of spending in the area of social programs, infrastructure, and that can release some crude estimates that I made up to 3 percentage points of GDP. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanjeev. And we have a question. If you don't know how to raise your hand when you look at the participants, between the participants and the chat, you can see raise hand, yes, no, go slower, go faster. Then I will have Tanya Irvin. Please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Tanya. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, also working with the International Center for Tax and Development. So thank you very much, Sanjeev, for that presentation. I think that the reform options that you highlight are very good, and they all made sense to me. However, I think these policy responses and reforms certainly would have been welcomed even in a pre-COVID environment. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on why COVID presents an opportunity to implement these reforms, and if you view COVID as something unique or special, providing a sort of opportunity or opening. Is this some sort of critical juncture to get these reforms through the door, so to speak? Thank you.
No, this is a very good question. And what I'm saying is I see COVID as a kind of a crisis. And a number of countries, and I'll give you a couple of examples, have implemented reforms which they were resisting for years. You probably didn't notice that Nigeria, a couple of weeks ago, removed all subsidies on petroleum products. It was something which was very, very controversial in the past, but they had no choice. They had to, because the revenue position had gone down so badly. Similarly, Saudi Arabia, for years, was thinking of putting in a sales VAT. And after many, many years of discussion, all the GCC countries, of which Saudi Arabia is a member, they agreed on a 5% VAT. But 3-4 weeks ago, Saudi Arabia tripled the VAT to 15%, which was being discussed for years, but they decided to do it now. The point I was trying to make is this is an opportunity for reform because there would be more acceptance of reform at this point because people see how bad the situation is. And the revenue position from my perspective is going to get much worse for some of the developing countries because of the factors that I discussed. The economic structure is changing. And so policymakers, they have resisted some of the reforms that they needed to do. And this crisis provides them an opportunity to embark on those reforms. We did, at the Center for Global Development, 5 country studies to look at what are the political constraints to raising more revenues. And you find everywhere, in all those countries, politics is the dominant force. And now there is an opportunity for the policymakers to embark on a comprehensive reform because of the crisis. That's the argument.
Thank you so much. I have also Agustin. He would like to ask one question. Please, Agustin, go ahead.
Yes, Sanjeev, thanks for the presentation. So I was wondering, given your experience working with government, I guess in capacity building programs on the fund and so on and so forth, what can be the 2 or 3 main points that would suggest to policymakers, governments in developing countries to take a look at when they decide whether to implement tax incentives or not? And I'm thinking, for instance, about sunset clauses or these kind of technicalities that can make a difference into whether these incentives will have impact at the end of the day or not.
I was supposed to organize another roundtable in April with the finance ministers, but because of the Corona crisis, we decided to cancel that event. But we had one in October, and the focus of that meeting was on tax expenditures. And so and of course, they all want to have tax expenditures to promote domestic industry. So that's why I said the idea is to be able to provide some kind of, or to engage in active industrial policy. But in the end, they end up turning into something to protect the political groups in the country. And when you said that there could be a time limit on the incentives, I visited one time Philippines some years ago to advise on this issue. And what did we find? And this was something that authorities were telling us themselves. They found that after 10 years, when the incentives were to expire, the industry will appear somewhere else, another place with a new name. So that enterprise didn't really go anywhere. So I think the targeted incentives that you talked about, such as linked to investment, they are always preferable to the kind of tax incentives that people have been giving in the past.
Thank you so much. We will go to our third speaker of today. We have 4 speakers, as you know, and the third speaker is Professor Edmund Valpy Fitzgerald, Professor of International Development Finance, Oxford University, and also member of the Independent Commission for the Reform on International Corporate Taxation. There is also a new report, and I will share the link to the report of the ICRICT with you here in this link.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Well, we're running a bit over time, so I will reduce my remarks on the basis.
No, it's okay. We have 1 hour, so 1 hour for the other, so you are okay. Please go ahead with your 50 minutes.
Okay. Anyway, my remarks are relatively short because we've already had a very clear exposition of the data and the problematic. I think it is common in both developed and developing countries that during the crisis, both government expenditure has gone up and that tax revenue has gone down for obvious reasons. I think what's important to note is that it's clear that government expenditure has gone up permanently. That is, in other words, that health expenditure is going to have to be much higher worldwide than it was in the past. So it's not just an emergency expenditure, it's structural change. And also, I think it's fairly clear that infrastructure expenditure on a whole series of new aspects of transportation, old people's care, etc., is going to go up permanently. So I think we have to face a world in which the ratio of government expenditure to GDP is going to rise and stay there. The big difference, I think, between the developed and the developing countries, the developed countries have been able to finance this with very large increases in debt, which has been made possible firstly by a regime of very low interest rates, by coincidence, but also by the fact that investors have not got anywhere really to put their money in at the moment, and in consequence are holding it in the form of government bonds. But I don't think we can expect that this debt level will be sustainable very far into the future, either because the economies will recover or because the trust in, let's say, the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Bank will not necessarily continue. In other words, that there is going to be a permanent increase in expenditure, both on the health and infrastructure side and also on the debt servicing side. Therefore, I think it's fairly clear that an increment in tax to GDP ratios worldwide is. So this isn't just a question of being more efficient or carrying out reforms, it's actually of changing the debt to GDP ratio. Now, the problem is that during this process, large and small corporations have mobilized themselves to claim that they need large tax cuts. In other words, that corporation tax should be cut as an incentive to restarting the economy, both in developed and developing countries. The ICRICT holds the position that this is exactly the wrong thing to do. Right? If anything, in an emergency of this kind, we would want to see an increase in tax to GDP ratios for the most wealthy and for corporations earning above normal profits during the crisis. There is a sense in which the corporation taxes are the only form of wealth tax that we have. Corporation taxes are essentially a tax on excess profits and, in effect, a withholding tax on dividends. And because the dividend income is concentrated in the upper 1+% worldwide, this is effectively a wealth tax. The second reason for maintaining or enhancing the corporate tax pressure is because these are a key source of redistribution from developed to developing countries, simply because, broadly speaking, developing countries are capital importers and developed countries are capital exporters. It is clear from our own research and the research of the fund that the impact of corporation tax on real investment levels, tax incentives on real investment levels, is very small. What tax incentives do affect is foreign direct investment flows, but these are financial flows, not real flows. The amount, although there is a statistical relationship between lower tax rates or tax incentives and FDI flows, there is no detectable relationship with real fixed capital formation. Now, in the particular case of the recovery from COVID-19, it's important to realize that the impact on the world economy has been one of disarticulation. What we've had is a breakdown in trade relations, in commercial relationships and so on, but the productive capacity has not been seriously affected. That's to say, the people with skills, the physical equipment has not changed radically. In this way, COVID is not like a war or like a disaster, like a hurricane or an earthquake. In an earthquake, you get a destruction of physical capacity. In a war, you get a loss of physical capacity from destruction, and also productive capacity is shifted into armaments production. People are killed, or young men and women are transferred, skilled men and women are transferred into armed forces. This is not what has happened. The main death has actually been among people like myself, old and redundant people. And if we want to be brutally cynical about it, one of the effects is actually to reduce the burden of pensions on younger generations. We'll ignore that for the moment. So the position of the ICRICT is this is not the moment for generalized corporation tax cuts. And if anything, we should be pressing for reforms which make effective corporate tax more internationally higher. Now, in this context, it's extremely unsettling or disquieting that the US a couple of days ago has pulled out and refused to support the OECD negotiation over global digital tax system. If you'll recall, there were two pillars, broadly speaking. Pillar one was about distributing the tax base so that taxes would be paid according to the level of activity of the corporation in different parts of the world. And pillar two, which is about setting a minimum effective tax rate, which would in effect mean that tax havens could not operate in the way that they do at the moment. Unfortunately, the US now says it will no longer support these initiatives, which are already been seriously watered down away. If we look at the three players in the OECD negotiations, broadly speaking, there was the US, the EU, and the G24 representing developing countries. The EU and the G24 wanted a much stronger regime in various dimensions. The US argued again and again and again for a much weaker regime, in effect trying to argue that the entire world tax system should mirror the US tax system. But now at the last moment, having made these concessions, the US has pulled out. And not as only has pulled out, but rather like a small boy pulling out of a football game, not only is the small boy game, but also he's going to take the ball away. And in particular, the US has now threatened with sanctions against the rest of the world if they implement the system on a multilateral basis. So I think this has to be something that we have to take into account. And when looking at international tax reform, you cannot rely on domestic tax reform alone. Taxation both of corporations and of the wealthier part of the population in developing countries relies to a great extent on international cooperation. This is why we have extreme doubts about some of the discussions about tax reform having to be based on taxing the informal sector or reducing VAT concessions, where the main problem is actually the taxation of international companies, many of which are now developing country-based, and also the internationally held assets of elites in developing countries. And any tax reform that doesn't take into account is bound to be a regressive tax reform. Now, one of the lessons I think we've learned from the COVID is that we're all in this together. The impact has been greater on the poor than on the rich, and greater on poor countries than rich countries, and so that any return to tax reform must be based on a more progressive tax system, not just on the efficiency of collecting taxes from poor consumers. Thank you.
So much. We would like to give some questions, and for you also to know, there are some blog posts that we have also written on multilateralism and on GLOBE and on COVID that is also in the blog post of GLOBALTAXGOV. And we are also, next week, we will have another blog post on the digital taxation and more looking at the choices of the countries. I would like to give, please, if you have a question, just raise your hand, but I would like to raise one question. Because normally developing countries are now trying also to find a way to have wealth taxes, for instance. But one of the things is this wealth tax also something that it is, because the developing countries are looking now for revenue. So they think one of the ways is to have a wealth tax for for rich people. So the question is whether this is also something that the ICRICT will support, and how do you see that, Professor Edmund Valpy?
No, certainly a wealth tax is on the agenda of many developing countries, and in particular, the tax not only on the domestic wealth of rich people in developing countries, which often is in the form of real estate or sort of rather shadowly held companies, but that's a domestic tax issue, but also on assets held internationally. So one of the first steps, I think, is for full information exchange between developed and developing countries as to the assets of developing country residents. And one of the difficulties is that developed countries, such as my own country, the UK, has been very loath to exchange information with developing countries about the assets of their wealthy people. So this is a step that could be taken straight away without any great difficulty of information exchange. As to ICRICT, as you know, the ICRICT has been working mainly on corporate tax reform. Also remembering, as I said, that corporate taxation, as indeed the Nobel Prize winner James Murley has pointed out frequently, corporate tax is the most effective wealth tax that we have at the moment, in the sense that it is effectively a tax on dividends. We are exploring the possibility of extending our work away just from corporations towards other major forms of wealth. The reason for this is that in recent decades, more and more capital is being held internationally, if you like, in private, non-quoted firms or trusts and so on and so forth, so that the old division between personal income tax and, on income, on current income, and corporation tax on, if you like, legally registered corporations is breaking down, and we need to have a new category. To address this problem is very difficult because while you can keep a handle on most major corporations, because they do have to register legally in the country they operate in, wealth is increasingly held behind shields of anonymity, in trusts and so on, in tax havens and so on. By tax havens, we're not just talking about palm-fronted, beach-fronted islands, but also countries like Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and so on. So what we're working towards is to try and see the feasibility of having what we call global asset registries. That is, that just as much of the assets are registered in developed countries, that tax havens should also register the assets held there, and that this information should be shared with tax authorities across the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have other questions. Before that, I forgot to say we apologize for not having the video, but there was some problems with the connection for the video. Then we have Frederick Feichemuller. He will ask one question.
Yes, thank you very much, Valpy, for your presentation. I have one question more regarding political strategy, maybe, or options that especially developing countries have at this moment. So you mentioned that a reform of international taxation is important for developing countries to raise revenues from wealth, but that the US is no longer supporting, at least in the domain of digital taxation, any multilateral solution at this moment. So I think this is kind of a dilemma for developing countries. Should they try to persuade the US in rethinking their choice and joining the table again, or do you think there are actually options to move forward or what on their own? And as we've seen, there are some countries are trying to introduce withholding tax or on digital services and similar. Is this a too dangerous step, or is this a realistic option?
Well, of course, the news has only come in through recently, and as I suggested, the developing countries and Europe themselves have made enormous concessions to the US in order to get the OECD proposal off the ground. Why the OECD proposal was important was that for the first time it allowed for global formulary apportionment. In other words, that the tax base would not be based on the country of origin of the company, but would be on its global operations. And for the first time, countries would share the tax base between them. Now, the sharing would probably start off as very unfair and unequal and etc., but at least it would be a huge first start as a principle. But now that that is gone, the first option obviously would be withholding taxes of the type you suggest, and already Spain and France and the UK are committed to these. The problem with them is partly they are inconsistent in that different countries will apply them in different ways, and that the Google and so on will be able to game the system just as much as they game it at the moment. The second reason is that the US has announced that it will exercise trade sanctions, tariff sanctions, against any country that applies these tariffs. So again, if France or the UK or anywhere else applies a Google tax, as it's called, the US says that it's going to apply tariff retaliation. What is ironic about all this is that the current administration in the US claims at the same time that Google and Amazon's are enemies of democracy and right thinking and Christianity and God knows what. And at the same time, they're defending these very companies, which are supposed to be part of the deep state, against countries worldwide. My own personal view, for what it's worth on the politics, is that if, let's say, the G25 and Europe, and possibly countries such as India, had a coordinated response and applied a single shared retention tax, then I think the weight of that might be enough to break the logjam. But we can't have an answer till November. If you can tell me who will win the elections in the US in November, I will tell you about the future of the Google tax.
Thank you so much. We definitely cannot avoid to discuss about the US because, of course, it's the elephant in the room right now. So we need to discuss about that. Thank you so much for all the insight and for the information, and also very valuable to see the new report from the ICRICT. And it's also available there in the chat for everyone to read it. Last speaker of today will be Alexandra Redhead. She's the lead tax and extractive sector for the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and also from the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining. Alexandra, you are next.
Thanks very much, Irma. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes, we do. Perfect.
Thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm sorry I was running a bit late, but it's been great to catch the last couple of presentations. So thank you again for the invitation. My job late in the day is to talk about tax incentives in the mining sector specifically. As Irma mentioned, I work for the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, which is a global organization representing governments of mining countries. So we have roughly 76 member countries, and we provide a range of technical assistance to our member countries on environmental and social issues, local content, so forth, and also tax. So we were very mindful of the implications for the sector as a result of COVID, and have produced guidance for members on how to evaluate requests for tax relief from mining companies during this period, and how to craft fiscal responses should they be required. But I'm going to step back a little bit and, as it says on the slide, talk about tax incentives pre, during, and post-COVID. I think the key messages from me in the short time that we have is, firstly, pre-COVID, tax incentives were and are less relevant to attracting mining investment. The second one is that during COVID, mining has not been uniformly affected, and so any incentives must be targeted. And post-COVID, rethinking mining fiscal policy to rebuild developing country finances, as the speakers before me have also mentioned. So those are the three messages from me in this presentation. In terms of pre-COVID, the IGF has done quite a lot of work in the area of mining tax incentives specifically. I think, it's no surprise, in general, the consensus is that tax incentives are not particularly effective or efficient at attracting investment in developing countries. I think that's certainly more the case for the mining sector in particular, because mining resources are location specific, they can't be moved. the primary drivers of mining investment are really the quality of the resource, the ability to access the resource, so infrastructure, access to ports and so forth, and then prices. To what is the market doing? Those are the things that are really motivating mining investment decisions. So consequently, mining investment is less mobile and responsive to tax incentives. So I think, you know, there's considerable literature on the problems around incentives generally for developing countries. I think that's amplified in the case of the mining sector in particular, where, you know, if anything, incentives are even less relevant. Nonetheless, despite being less relevant, they are still prevalent. So I invite you to dig into the IGF mining tax incentives database. So this is a database of, as it says on the tin, tax incentives in the sector. We looked in particular at incentives that are contained in mining development agreements. So those of you that are familiar with this sector will know that to a large extent, fiscal terms are contained in project-specific contracts between the host country government and the investor, and this is where a lot of the tax incentives lie. So it's a bit misleading. Often we look at the sort of benchmark fiscal regime in the country. That's a bit misleading in the mining sector, although there may be some incentives in the fiscal regime at the country level. If we look closer into the contracts, there's a lot more going on there. So this is a database of, I think, about 104 mining contracts for about 21 countries, and we're constantly growing it. But on the screen here, you can see this is tax incentives by region. And I think that the main thing to note here is just in Africa in particular, the number of incentives that are contained in the mining contracts. So as I mentioned, you know, this is certainly a problem in general in the sector, but in Africa in particular, that there's a significant portion of incentives in the contracts themselves, which raises all sorts of questions around transparency, oversight, accountability with respect to decisions around granting those incentives, and certainly monitoring those incentives, and issues around discretion and corruption. The second one here from our database is just to show you, we look at a number of different types of tax incentives that you would typically see in the sector. So you've got things like accelerated depreciation, tax holidays, loss carry forwards, tax stability agreements. So again, this is very particular to the mining sector, or oil and gas as well, where fiscal terms are often stabilized, which creates another level of difficulty when it comes to tax incentives in mining, is that unfortunately, if these are written into mining contracts that are subject to fiscal stabilization provisions, your ability to unpick those incentives is limited, which is an issue that we see right now in relation to COVID, where some mining companies are actually performing well during COVID, in particular gold companies. And some of our member countries in West Africa who have very old contracts with gold mining companies that contain some fairly outlandish tax incentives that are even more unnecessary now than they were before, but because of stability provisions, it's hard to unpick. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of the types of tax incentives that we see. So that's looking backwards. So tax incentives have been a real bugbear for the extractive industries in particular. The argument for them is weak at best. Nonetheless, they persist, which I think speaks to the political issues that have been discussed already. Is despite a lot of empirical evidence and guidance over the years, we haven't necessarily made as much headway as we would have liked in terms of reducing the use of tax incentives in general and in particular in this sector. So what have we seen during COVID in terms of incentives? So I think, as I mentioned earlier, the interesting thing about mining is that it hasn't been uniformly affected. So you can see that some minerals and metals certainly have suffered. I mean, the economic recession has left no stone unturned. Mining is not immune from that. So there certainly has been, many mines have had to stop production, stop activity because of containment measures. mineral prices have dipped in a number of cases, but you can see here the price of gold, for example. So we know gold is a store of wealth, a safe haven during uncertainty. So investors have flocked to gold during this period, which has pushed up the price fairly significantly. But even metals like copper and iron ore that were initially affected during COVID have actually rebounded or bounced back quite quickly. So the picture is mixed for mining, and in some cases, some commodities and companies have emerged either relatively unscathed or better off in some cases. What have we seen in terms of relief? So when we started working on this a few months ago, we issued guidance together with ATAF, and we were expecting a flood of requests from our members to help them deal with requests for tax relief from investors. But actually, it's been very limited. So you can see there's 2 examples on the screen, and there are very few beyond this of specific relief for the mining sector. And in general, we think that's a really positive story, that there hasn't been a flood of requests, there hasn't been governments granting incentives to mining companies, and that's largely because mining companies have also benefited from economy-wide measures, which is, the preferred approach is that if there is going to be relief, it should be economy-wide rather than sector-specific. Although in the case of some of these precious metals companies, there's probably an argument against any relief at all, and in fact an argument for them to support host country governments during this period by prepaying taxes and royalties if they're in a position to do so. So it's been interesting that we haven't seen a lot, and maybe it's because the mining sector was already blessed with incentives to start with. Could be a reason. But of course, we're not out of the woods yet here. So we are still, encouraging countries rather, that if they do embark on tax relief, it should be targeted. So here, knowing your industry and the commodity is critical. I mentioned how mixed the picture has been for mining. So understanding the value chain, understanding how those commodities are faring is more important than ever. The phase of production, obviously, is this in exploration phase? Is it in development? Is it in production? So incentives for companies that are exploring, perhaps less useful than companies that are in production and have a workforce and so forth. There's a lot of guidance you can see on the screen, and I think Irma is going to share the links in the chat, so you can have a look at our guidance for more detailed information. The only other thing I want to mention here is around the conditions that should be set. So what our view here is, the types of relief that you would potentially offer, should be very targeted, company specific or commodity specific. Things like, VAT, speeding up VAT refunds, which are a big problem typically in this sector. Things like, payroll taxes, all of that. Standard relief applies here. Where we get into more extreme measures, so mining companies that are really in distress, it's possible that governments might look to waive or defer royalties. So royalties being production royalties in this instance, so payment for the right to extract. So of course we would encourage countries to avoid that at all costs. Because of the nature of the payment, but if they do, that they should get something in return. So we've seen an increase in the sector in terms of host country participation and interest in equity stakes in mining projects. So certainly if governments are foregoing royalties, then it would seem appropriate they should get an equity stake in these mines going forward, or it should be treated as a loan. And then the last point, as I made earlier, which I like to keep mentioning in the hope that perhaps some companies will pick it up, is that there are some mining companies, gold mining companies, that are very cash rich at the moment. And if they were interested to further cultivate the relationship with the host country and to nurture their social license, that things like prepaying royalties and taxes would seem a good step. CapEx is down, so expenditure in mining is down, as you'd expect. There's a lot of uncertainty, but it's really, again, what we're saying to countries is investment is down, not because the fundamentals have necessarily changed, but because of containment, because of uncertainty, and because of difficulties accessing finance. So, you know, we recognize investment is going to be critical post-COVID. Unfortunately, there are some isolated instances of mining companies already requesting tax cuts in Australia. The Minerals Council of Australia is calling on the government to provide tax cuts to spark the next mining boom. I think our view here again is, you know, avoid incentives. Nothing has changed. If anything, some mining companies are better off. And investors will return as the market stabilizes, finance becomes available. You know, sure, there will be exceptions, but I think for the most part, investors will return. So incentives at this point would only be speeding up that investment rather than determining whether or not that investment actually happens, in our view. So you can see here there's already been a spate of M&A activity, particularly in the gold sector, and that's likely, you know, to increase. So that's our message during COVID, and I think post-COVID, so looking beyond. The other thing that we've heard from countries, which has been very interesting, is I mentioned that we were expecting a rush on relief, but actually the countries that have reached out to us to request our help to improve and reform their mining tax system, which again we think is very encouraging. So some countries are considering tax increases. So Ghana is looking at a sliding scale royalty for gold. So that means the royalty rate increases with the price of gold. In general, over the last few years, there's been a trend towards higher mining taxes, particularly in Africa. As I mentioned, mining's been resilient, and we've got falling oil revenues. So many of these extractive countries, or these resource-rich countries that rely heavily on oil, are now going to have to look more to mining, I think. So it increases pressure on that source of revenue. So we're launching we had planned to launch this before COVID, but I think now it's needed more than ever, a program of work on the future of resource taxation. So this is a partnership between ourselves and ATAF. And it's a 3-year project which is intended to look at, you know, where we go next. So there's a lot of disquiet and discontent amongst resource-rich countries that they don't collect enough, partly due to overly generous tax incentives, but other reasons as well, tax planning, you know, weak fiscal regimes in some cases. So this is a program of work that aims to bring together governments to look at what are the possibilities. So what are the alternatives? What are the different policy innovations? So the 2 questions that we're seeking to answer in this program of work is, are governments able to maximize revenues from mining under the dominant fiscal regime? So mining in particular is pretty outdated. My colleague would suggest that it's a tax system from colonial times for the most part, which is a small royalty and a corporate income tax, compared to something like oil and gas, where you see a lot more variety and, you know, that's been much more progressive and favorable for states. So we're looking at, you know, can we actually achieve the goal here under the status quo, and how are the changes in the industry also likely to impact taxation, and what are the implications for future fiscal regimes? So things like automation and so forth. So really this is a project designed to put everything on the table, and see what are the policy innovations and administrative innovations that are already out there, and how can we bring together a range of stakeholders to dialogue on this. So that's all from me, Irma. So hopefully a bit of the past, the present, and the future.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And we have 2 questions. I will give first the word to Juliana Cubillos, and then after will be Amadeo.
Great. Alexandra, thank you for your presentation. It's very enlightening. I will want to ask you about how, I mean, you have thought about several options that there are for increasing the activity towards taxation for the mining companies and pairing it up in a way with what has been happening in the policy for oil and gas industry. But at the same time, there are some kind of ideas that they are already pernicious on giving too much terrain to these companies for bargaining from a lot of tax incentives and fiscal stabilization clauses. So what would be, I mean, what is the best key way to to make policy for the mining companies right now, thinking about the crisis? Should the governments start introducing sunset provisions to make sure that these measures will not kind of benefit these entities for long enough, as opposing to what the government is going to receive from the measure? Or should it be more targeted towards kind of like making these entities reinvest directly into the country by kind of incentivizing the options for lowering their tax burden towards direct contribution towards climate change or any other policies? What's your view on that?
Thanks. Shall we take the second question, Irma, or shall I respond to that?
If you are okay, we can answer and short, and in case that there's a discussion, then we need to continue, and then after we still have time, but yes.
Okay. Thanks very much for your question. I think so. There's quite a lot in there. So where to start? I think I'll start with your last point, which is really around, you know, should we be perhaps deprioritizing tax, I think is what you're sort of suggesting, and prioritizing other forms of investment or other ways that mining investment can feed into the economy. And I think that's certainly true that it is important, and my colleagues within IGF that work on this around encouraging local content, so jobs, procurement, industrialization, so greater value addition, and making sure that to what extent possible the raw materials are transformed into a higher value product. All of that is really important and worth pursuing, and are topics that we work on with governments. However, what I would say is that for the most part, at least in the mining sector, revenue has always been the primary benefit for governments, and I think it will continue to be, and possibly even more so going forward, because, for example, we see the rise in automation in the mining sector, significantly fewer jobs. There's a mine in Ghana that the Abwasi gold mine, it had 10,000 workers back in the day. It shut down for a period. It reopened. It had 2,000 workers. It's still a lot, but mining often exists in these enclaves and actually is not well connected to the rest of the economy. And if anything, jobs and procurement, I think, are less a part of the contract, if you like, between investors and government. So we anticipate more pressure on revenue collection. I think we also anticipate greater participation by governments. We're already seeing this in relation to particularly energy minerals, so things like lithium, cobalt, copper, that are necessary to green our economies, that the prices for those minerals are going up, and so governments actually want a greater stake in the value chain. So I think revenues will be important, and I think we'll see more state participation potentially. But I think more generally, in terms of how to design any tax incentives, I think you're talking about sunset clauses and so forth. I mean, I think all of that is critical, and if they are going to be offered at all, and more financial modeling is needed there, because in many cases, countries that we work with, they haven't modeled these projects before they agree to give incentives. And also, one final point is the issue with technology and automation is that the pace of extraction will speed up. So in countries where we see a mining project has a 10-year life and a 5-year tax holiday, there's not much left at the end of the day. So I think that's an interesting dimension as well in terms of tax policy design and incentives.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. Now I give the word to Amadeo.
Thank you very much, Irma. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. And Alexandra, it was really a very interesting presentation. And I think also your policy recommendations, I really love them, because I think it's really needed to share these things, because sometimes it's really not understood how people should act. So I was wondering about, so we had a clear idea about the public sector side. From the corporation side, I was wondering, in mining sector jargon, I think you have this concept that is very interesting of responsible sourcing. And maybe you know much better than me whether it works or not. And I was thinking in taxation, it's really something that it might be transposed, because if you're responsible in sourcing your investments from a tax perspective, you can be more sustainable. And I was wondering, do you believe this concept can increase in its efficiency after COVID? Because what I saw, for example, in Italy, my country, is that COVID-19 really made people focus a little bit more on this. For example, when there were tax incentives to be given to certain companies, the population started to complain about the fact that these companies didn't have the seat in Italy, and therefore we were giving money without a tax return. And this is probably a concept of tax reputation, which is becoming more and more important in these years. And I was wondering, do you believe there is a possibility that this becomes the status quo also in this sector, when in the tax sector, when there are investments, especially of this kind? Thank you.
Thanks, Amadeo, for your comments and for your question. So I think, yeah, I mean, the issue with responsible sourcing is really around, obviously value chain, in terms of procurement, but also, where particular minerals and metals come from, and conflict regions and so forth. I'm not sure. I know that certainly there is a lot of pressure on mining companies as well, like other companies at the moment that are benefiting from economy-wide relief, that insofar as they're, located offshore or they're engaged in aggressive tax planning activities, that there's a lot of concern, quite rightly, amongst citizens that they are pocketing, the benefits of tax relief. So I think the same pressures exist in the mining sector in that regard, and possibly even more so because it's such a visible sector. So there's always been quite a high level of scrutiny over mining and oil and gas projects, because they're so visible and they're often such an important part of the economy. So I think, and mining companies are very aware of that for the most part. And so I think they are, they have often been some of the more forthcoming companies in terms of sharing country by country reporting. We've also been obviously operating excess profit taxes for a long time. I know that that's something that's been up for debate in all of this post-COVID discussion. And I think there's opportunities to learn actually from the resource sector in terms of the effectiveness of those sorts of excess profit taxes. And I think I can say fairly clearly that they haven't been effective. They're rarely collected in any resource-rich country that I'm aware of, and most resource-rich countries have actually unwound those taxes in recent years. Now, I don't know, I haven't really given it enough thought as to whether there are specifics there in the mining sector that would mean those taxes are less effective. They obviously have to be monitored well, and depends on how you design them. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if that directly answers your question, but there's a few thoughts there.
Definitely, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have a question that was left from Anna Maina, and that was for Sanjeev. Anna, you're next.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the presentation from all the four presenters. Very informative. I had a question for Mr. Sanjeev Gupta on tax incentives, especially some of the tax breaks that have been given during the time of COVID. So I was just wondering, apart from losing revenue from tax incentives, we also have the challenge of the informal sector taxation, which is also another potential area to finance during this time. So I was just wondering, what do you think? Are there some tax incentives that the informal sector can be given to support the economy during the COVID crisis? Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anna, the point here is that can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the point here is that informal sector is already not paying taxes as much as they should. So what more concessions can you start giving them? In some countries, they have reduced the VAT, the standard VAT rate, and they have reduced some other forms of taxation. So already the informal sector is getting some benefits in the COVID era. The issue is you don't want to really distort the tax system so much by giving incentives to different types of households in the economy, which makes the restoration of the pre-COVID era very, very difficult, because every political group is going to oppose going back to the pre-COVID tax system. So in my view, that already one was seeing huge political opposition to making any changes to tax system. And it was not because of a lack of advice, it was just because different groups were opposed to higher taxes. And now if you give them more concessions, it will be very difficult 1 year, 2 years down the line to go back to the pre-COVID period.
Actually, I have a nice idea of a nice information that we got from Philippines, because they are busy with the comprehensive tax reform package. And while we were working for this article on tax incentives in Philippines and Singapore, we were looking at the second part of the package, that is the one on tax incentives. And they decided, because of COVID-19, they decided to make the changes to the tax incentive, to that package, that has not been implemented, but now this is being discussed. And there were two things that strike me down, that in principle, the package was about reducing within the next 10 years from 30 to 20% the corporate income tax rate. But when you look at the new what they call create recovery economy, and so they decided just to change it to 25% immediately starting July 2020. So the idea of having a tax incentive that will be the reducing of the corporate income tax rate, was immediately taken out because of the COVID. And the second part that was very interesting to see is that normally they are working a lot towards reducing the number of investment agencies and also the investment laws. And at the same time, they decided, because of COVID, they decided that they will give the discretionary power to the president to give incentives. And we are normally saying, Minister of Finance, and this is what we need to do, and there needs to be clarification and everything. So that's also the reason why I think that it is important to raise the issue. And this chapter, we are working with Mirka Baharova, and will be available hopefully by the end of this year in a book that we are also editing. I guess Agustin has something to say about it.
Yeah, it's more on the role of informality, which is something that I mentioned during my presentation, but I didn't have the time to discuss. And because of the question, I will just briefly comment on that. I think it's crucial for developing countries. So governments have been trying to help the worst off. And I think tax expenditures are not the best policy tool to do so for many reasons. So clearly, those in the informal sector are outside the tax system. They are not filing tax returns. So it's difficult to reach them through the tax system. So that's a kind of mechanical consequence of informality. And also, there are ways, and there's one policy recommendation by Ben Reed's, a guy that is writing in Forbes in the US. There are ways of using, kind of combining the tax system and universal cash transfers, for instance, to make a better use of taxpayers' money. And that would be, you grant a cash transfer, universal cash transfer, for instance, you reach everybody, but then you make the rich adjust through the tax system to avoid, scarce resources going to the pockets of those that are not in need. So these are things that governments, unfortunately, are not exploring of how to improve the effectiveness of these policies, but there are ways of trying to think outside the box and come up with smart solutions.
Thank you so much, Agustin. We have a few minutes. If there is no one that we have a question, we can also have run out with some specific. I don't know, is there anyone with a question, a very urgent question? No? Okay, so there are three things we could identify from this discussion. And first of all, as you see, tax incentives can be taken from different perspectives. And we are trying to look the mining, the corporate also, and the economic side, and also the tax policy side. And one of the things that we have also identified is the need to have targeted incentives that comes through the whole presentations, and also the type of incentives that the countries are now introducing, and looking at, for instance, how these incentives will link us still to the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's not only COVID short term, but also long term. And I think that the speakers have given us some ideas on that, as well as developing countries also making use of aid from the International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank, from donor countries, trying to make to get loans in this case, but also countries taking different views on what we need to do for COVID. So like Alexandra was mentioning, instead of reducing the taxes, they are increasing the taxes, and others will say, no, but actually what we need to do is to, like I mentioned with Philippines, they need to reduce the taxes and do something immediately, short-term initiatives. So the questions are how countries are reaching the level of the importance of the objectives that they want to reach with the COVID-19, is to keep the economy going, is to give cash stimulus, is to give cash, how is to solve the problem of cash from the companies, what do we want to do. But also what is important is under what conditions can the reforms, tax reforms take place. And that's something that is before COVID, now with COVID and after COVID, and we need to think about these conditions. What is what we need? And I think that also the report from ICRICT provide us with some views on how international corporate taxation is being looked at in terms of COVID. Is anyone with a question? Agustin, would you like to also close since it's our seminar? So.
No, just to thank you all. It was great. I think thank you, Ali, Sanjeev, and Valpy, particularly for taking the time. Much appreciated. And thank to all participants. It was great.
Yeah, and we will have also the video and the slides on the website, and we will announce it. We will send an email to all participants. So thank you so much.
And we will have in, sorry, for those Spanish speakers or those that can understand Spanish at least, we're having a similar seminar on the same topic with a focus on Latin America, Ibero-America next week. So feel free to join. Other speakers will be taking part, Irma included. So yeah, we look forward to having you all there as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.